Yeah, interesting. Where we are, I don't know, the date.
A lot of.
I'm sorry?
stuff.
So you might give them the date,
Yeah, actually.
ASZC to start, you know.
I'm deaf on this side.
I've been.
I can tell you're talking.
I'm planning an board.
You typically say
Where
the
I
map
take,
television center.
which is.
Okay.
Whatever it is, date.
All right, so go ahead and get started. Today's date's March 16th, 2025. And our discussion today is going to be on the six paramitas. We use the term a lot. We talk about the six paramitas, but it's not that often we actually stop and discuss what the paramitas are. So I'll let that get
You want me to do that first?
yeah, go ahead and serve the tea, then I'll start in earnest.
While we're waiting, I do want to make a couple of announcements. Let's encourage everyone to check the calendar for upcoming events. We have retreats in April at Watershed, starting the 9th of April and running through the 13th. That's my Dharma retreat, and which we will be exploring some of the highlights of the original frontier and how they apply to being in the rural setting in nature, and how the original frontier relates to nature, spirit of nature. 3 days later, we have a silent retreat, which runs the next week. So if you have the time and time off, you can do a 2-week retreat in April. And in May, we have a new resident coming in place. He will be here for 90 days for an ongo. He's a yoga teacher. He and another former student, a longtime student of mine, Doug Johnson, Harrison Sokolov is the young man coming to be in residency. And he and Doug Johnson are going to beginning yoga classes on a regular basis. We will start them in May with some events, and they will start regularly occurring in June. So we'll be offering yoga here at the Zen Center starting in June. That's it. Shinjin Mike Goldman is regaling us with a talk on the six paramitas today.
Okay.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah. So the paramitas, the translation, first of all, the translation of the paramitas is pretty loose. What most people describe them as is as the six perfections. What it actually, if you translated it literally, paramita, it translates essentially to the highest, the most excellent, or the other shore. There's that implication in there, the other shore, and mita being an action, or the literal translation, that which goes. So kind of what the word means, paramita, is that which is gone to the other shore. You might remember we just chanted the Heart Suit, gone, gone, gone to the other shore. So this is kind of a way to describe the process of enlightenment. Okay, so the paramitas are often tied to the third noble truth. When you look at the four noble truths, first one is that life is going to be out of balance and difficult and trouble. Just being alive is going to cause problems. Second, you're causing those problems by your own attachments, your own desires. So the first two of the noble truth are pretty nihilistic. Life's going to be hard. You're making it harder. Okay, but the third and the fourth, we're kind of promised there's a way out of this. It does not have to be this way. And kind of the way that I look at the third and the fourth noble truth is, with the third noble truth, we're kind of given the what. Here's what you need in order to get out of this mess. And the fourth noble truth being, and here's how you're going to do it. So that what is, if this was like a box on a computer screen, we click on the box of the third noble truth, the six paramitas are essentially what's going to come up. Okay, so the idea is we're going to transcend the problems of the first two noble truths, and we are going to go to the other shore. So it's this idea of transcending things. So it begs the question, transcending what? So I think the simple answer is transcending the three poisons, those activities in your brain that are causing these problems: greed, hate, and delusion. So that's one way to look at what we're trying to transcend. Another way, if we dig a little deeper, put a little finer point on it, transcending the dualistic the dualism of egocentric mindsets versus the non-dualistic and non-dualistic mindsets. So self versus self of no self, ego versus acceptance in a way. Okay, so that's what the paramitas are trying to tell us what to do. So what are they? So in the Mahayana tradition, there are six paramitas. In the Theravada tradition, there's an additional four. And the history of these, the earliest known accounts are in what's called the Pitaka Sutta, and they're grouped together, but they're not grouped together in categories. They're not numbered as we know them now in the original Pali Canon. They're all there, they're all discussed, but they're not given to us in order. They're not grouped together, and they're not termed the six paramitas or the 10 paramitas. So there's this idea that later commentators actually group them together to kind of make them easy to understand. And the Pitaka Sutra is really interesting because what that translates to is the basket of discourses. And what folklore tells us that this was remember when the Buddha spoke and the Buddha taught, none of this stuff was written down. Ananda had one of his earliest followers and one of his cousins had an absolutely brilliant photographic memory. He remembered every single thing the Buddha said, and he was able to turn those into chants so that the other monks could remember them and recite them. And sometime around 400 years later, they started writing these things down. So one of the original things that was written down was these discourses that Ananda remembered, and that's where the paramitas first turn up. So this can be considered one of the core teachings of Buddhism, and it's going to show up in virtually every school of Buddhism, even though there might be some variations from place to place. Okay, so some later commentators actually looked at this as kind of a commentary on the Eightfold Path. You know, because as anybody knows, Eightfold Path can be kind of confusing, kind of hard to follow. So what they think this originally was an attempt to make anybody that read these writings to make the Eightfold Path a little easier to follow. So what are the six paramitas? And what I'll do is I'll read through them, and then we're going to kind of go through each of them and put a finer point on it. So the six paramitas, the first one is generosity or dana. The second one is sila or morality. And the third one is kasanti. And kasanti typically gets translated as patience or endurance. Okay. And then virya, diligence or energy. And then jhana, or meditation or concentration. And this one is going to get really interesting. But keep in mind that the word meditation is a Western word. That is not what the original Pali writers or Mahayana writers that came later, or even in the Chinese tradition. Meditation was not a word that they would have used, and it's got a lot of connotations. So what this is actually talking about and what gets tossed around is the idea of medication are going to probably be two different things. Okay, so kind of keep that in mind. And then the last one, prajna. Okay, we chanted this, half dozen times in the Heart Sutra, prajna paramita, and that translates to wisdom. Okay, so they're kind of arranged in an interesting way, and this is a fantastic book. if anybody wants to get a copy of it. It's called The Six Perfections. It's by a guy named Dale Wright. And he goes through each of the paramitas, but I don't really agree with everything he says in the book, even though it's very well done, very well researched, because what he says is the first three paramitas are for the general public, that anybody, desiring to live a more equitable, better life could put these into play. So anybody should be able to put generosity, morality, and patience into their life. Okay, the second three, diligence, meditation, and wisdom, he says that's kind of reserved for people that commit to the formal path. That's for monks and priests and initiates and on down the line. That kind of went sideways with me. That one didn't really do it for me because the way that I've kind of interpreted this is, if you look at these all like faucets, you've got a bank of faucets, and you can open them up and a flow will come out. You can dial in how open you want them to be, each one, because as we go through these, there can be a point where you're too generous. I mean, I don't know if you could be too moral, but you could be pedantic about your morals. Okay, there can be a point where you put too much energy into something and where you burn yourself out. So there has to be kind of a restriction on each of these. The same way we look at the eightfold path. It's not right versus wrong. It's balance. A wheel, when it's in balance, is said to be righted. Okay, so there's a point, an angle of repose for each of these, but that control is going to be wisdom. So you've got this master faucet and five other faucets, and you've got the master to know how generous, how moral, how much energy to sink into something. Okay, so there's this kind of the way that I look at it is the prajna paramita kind of exists as this regulator of our own efforts. And so that's just a disagreement between me and Wright, because I don't think that diligence, concentration, and wisdom are just reserved just for the formal path. I think they're just as accessible to anybody as anything else is. In the Theravedic tradition, we have an additional four: skillful means, strength, aspirations, and something that they refer to as primordial wisdom, which I really never got a good definition for, but that's in the Theravedic tradition. So why don't we go through each of these and put a little bit more detail into it, and see if we can get to an accepted meaning on what each of these mean, and hopefully get a little bit of insight of what it's supposed to mean in your life as a Buddhist. So first, I'm going to start with dana. And that is defined as the willingness to give others what they need with joy, without regret, with no expectation of reward. Okay, without dana, this practice doesn't exist. Without dana, we can't afford this building. We can't keep the lights on. Okay, so we depend on dana to keep this practice going. And, with our current political situation, I think there's going to be a lot of aspects of our lives that are going to need a lot more dana than we've given them before, because we can't count on government funding any longer to do things like preserve national parks, preserve wild spaces, and take care of people that are not able to take care of themselves. So it's an aspect of kindness to it, and a willingness to give when we may not receive that much benefit. One of the first things I thought of when I started writing on this, and this is something that Steve will be able to follow really easily, but in evolutionary biology, one of the questions that's always come up is, where exactly does natural selection hit? Is it hitting the individual? Is it hitting the genes? Is it hitting the group, the community? Because a lot of animals do things that are not in their best interest preserve the group. If you watch a flock of birds, like you could go right out here to the park and watch this happen. Flock of songbirds, and they're trying to evade a red-shouldered hawk, a predator. They're going to move as a unit. But the problem is, one of them is going to get picked off. So there is this idea of this altruism. It's not in their best interest, but it's in the best interest of the group. So I think that Donna is something that is programmed into us, into our genes. So in order to keep the group going, the community going, we make certain sacrifices in order to that may not help us as individuals. And somebody asked, I was talking about that once, and somebody said, "Well, give me an example." And I said, "Well, homosexuality. At any given time, 15% of our population is homosexual. They're not going to breed. But we evolved to live in bands of about 50 to 100 individuals. And there's not a mammal on the planet that breeds at 50-50 ratio where everybody gets to breed. So if you have about 15% of the population that's not going to breed, that's more adult attention to fewer offspring. More of those offspring are going to survive." Okay, so I think that on some level, and I know that went a little far in the weeds, but I think that altruism is baked into us. It's in our genes to be communal animals and take care of each other. And this aspect of Buddhist practice is just taking something that's already there and say, stick with that. Keep giving to the community for the good of everybody. And this is be summed up in the utilitarianism, the philosophy that gained a lot of traction in Britain in the 1600s. The greatest good for the greatest number. So I think that one's pretty simple to follow. Scylla, or the idea of morality. I can't think of anything in human history that's got wider interpretation as what is moral. What is moral from one group to the other. And here's another really great historical example. Once again, I'm going to get out into the weeds. Look at the Mongols and their conquest of the Arab world and the conquest of the European world, and how Europeans and Arabs viewed the Mongols. And they viewed them as bloodthirsty maniacs, completely immoral, bloodthirsty maniacs. And in reality, what was happening, one of the most egregious sins that you could do in the Mongol world, so this is their morality, was harming an emissary. So when the Mongols came through and conquered a place, they sent emissaries first. And the emissary said, "We're coming through, you're going to pay us tribute, and that's just how it's going to be. You're not really capable of stopping us." And they would send the emissary back missing his head. Okay, so that's the most egregious moral outrage you could have afflicted on a Mongol emissary. And the Mongols came through and just wiped everybody out. So one group to another, what is moral can be a really big difference. But in the Dharma, what is considered moral is following the Dharma in all aspects, but not without thinking. So the idea is refraining from harm. Remember, well, I don't think anybody's taken their initiate vows, but when you take your initiate vows, when and if you decide to take those, what you vow is you vow to do no harm, and you vow to do only good, and you vow to assist others to do good. I think that's a pretty good, simple summation of morality. Okay, so that's Scylla, that's morality. Xanthi, the ability to not be perturbed by anything. Okay, this one is super interesting because I'm always like trying to pull aspects of the Dharma back to biology, back to how we function as a biological animal, as an entity. And the way that I would look at Kasati is that when you're hit with stimulus, you're responding to that stimulus out of your prefrontal cortex instead of reacting to it out of your amygdala. Okay. And how do you learn how to do that? You learn how to do that by sitting. Okay. So, it can also, I think, be equated to a certain amount of stoicism.
Can you explain the amygdala thing? I think some haven't heard that explanation.
Okay, sure. At the base of you've got your brain, and at the base of your brain, you've got a little organ about the size of an almond called the amygdala. And that amygdala attaches to the vagus nerve, which runs through all of your internal organs. And it controls your fight or flight response. And when it gets triggered, it dumps a lot of hormones into your blood system, and you're ready to either defend yourself or take off running. Okay. The problem is, not even 30,000 years ago, we were fending off predators, rival tribes, all of these other things. We had to be hyped up to stay alive. We don't live like that anymore, but we've got this huge system for triggering us into these very intense emotional situations. Okay. And at the other end of the brain, up here behind your forehead, you've got the prefrontal cortex, which is where your higher level thinking takes place. It's where ethics happens, morality happens, cause and effect. All these things happen up here. And what's interesting is that those two parts of your brain don't connect until you're in your early 20s. And this is why teenagers make such bad decisions, because the prefrontal cortex isn't even really attached to their brain. But one of the things that happens in sitting, and they did a really large scale experiment on this over at Emory, and a bunch of us were part of it. But in sitting, since we get hit with all of the same emotional input, all of the same information, but you keep sitting, you don't just hop up and do something. It starts to reroute the brain, actually rewire the brain so that more energy is coming into the prefrontal cortex, more information goes through that part of your brain than goes through the amygdala. And the process starts at about 6 months, but by about 3 years of an established sitting practice, your amygdala has shrunk, and the bonds between your prefrontal cortex and the rest of your brain are thicker and heavier. Okay, so you've actually rerouted your brain. So when you get hit by stimulus, you don't just have to react. It buys you time to respond. Okay, and that's something you can take with you everywhere you go, because the longer you stay in here and sit, the difference between your life sitting in here on a cushion and your life out in the world, they start to become the same. Okay, takes a little while, doesn't happen overnight, but keep sitting and it will happen. You will actually rewire the way your brain functions. Okay, so that's this idea of trying to achieve this state of Kshanti. Okay, Furia, energy. I came across this really interesting quote in this document called the Visuddhimaya, and that was written in the 5th century in Sri Lanka. And what they define this as, the state of energy, is a state of action of one who is vigorous. Its manifestation is non-collapse, just as new timbers prevent a house from falling, or strong reinforcement enables an army to defeat the enemy. Energy should be regarded as the root of all attainments. Another translation of Virya is spiritual diligence. So that one's really interesting because this is one that I think can go south really easily. Because I said, there's like a cutoff point for, when you've put too much energy into one of these paramitas and it starts to get harmful. Think about energy for a second. It doesn't mean anything moral or ethical at all. We want to talk about energy. Serial killers have energy. So this one is one that can be used for bad really easily. And that's kind of like mindfulness. People just throw the term mindfulness out there is that, all mindfulness is good. You want to see mindfulness, hang around with a sociopath. They are mindful. So that's kind of interesting. And then jhana or dhyana in Pali is concentration, meditation, or sitting. And it's defined as the full body awareness in which the mind becomes very powerful and is still but not frozen and is able and thus able to observe and gain insight into the changing flow of experience. I really like that passage. Gain insight into the changing flow of experience. And this one is really interesting because the original Pali writers, this was the only one of the paramitas where they actually went deeper and deeper into phases. That there's 4 phases to this one. So phase number 1 is the first jhana, and that's called the secluded form, and that's where you start to experience mindfulness and joy. The second jhana is referred to as the suppression of reason. Third jhana, the joy subside and there ceases to be a difference between pleasure and pain. Fourth jhana is the experience is beyond all of these ideas of cognizance. All of these things fall away. As Dogen said, mind and body fall away. Okay. How long is that going to take? I don't have any idea. But it's something I think we're all still working at. But it's kind of interesting that they divided this one up into 4 phases. Okay, and in the Arya Sangata, which is a very early sutra, I found this really interesting passage. It says about jhana. It says, this dharma leads not to disenchantment or dispassion or cessation or stilling or direct knowledge or unbinding, but only to the reappearance in the dimension of neither perception nor non-perception. So I left. I mean, that's, buddy, what are you talking about? So that one I turned over in my head, and I still don't have a very good answer. I mean, I wrote here in my notes, what could this possibly mean?
Could you read that again, please?
Sure, yeah, because it's actually there's kind of this comical edge to this one. This dharma leads not to disenchantment or dispassion or cessation or stilling of or direct knowledge or unbinding, but only to the reappearance in the dimension of neither perception or non-perception. So I left. So I thought about that one for a good long time, and I think that what it's trying to say is that jhana alone isn't going to cut it. I know a yoga teacher. I was really frustrated because I didn't start yoga until I was in my late 50s, so I was very stiff, and I'm terrible at it. I look like a Neanderthal trying to do yoga, and I was frustrated with that. And the teacher said, "Don't get too frustrated. Some of the biggest jerks I've ever met in my life can put both of their feet behind their head." And I thought that could kind of apply in here too. I mean, somebody could sit absolutely still in perfect form and still be the biggest jerk you've ever met. So I interpreted that passage to mean that sitting alone won't do it. That we have to incorporate these other things. We have to incorporate to the Eightfold Path and the rest of the other 5 paramitas. And then finally, prajna paramita or wisdom. And when we just chanted the Great Heart of Perfect Wisdom Sutra, I mean, how many times do we just come right out and say prajna paramita? I think it's in there 3 times. right at the very beginning. You know, what was Avalokiteshvara practicing? He was practicing Prajnaparamita. So it just keeps coming back as this idea. So the Pali idea, or the Pali translation, the word may not actually mean wisdom. It may be something closer to discernment. Okay, so that's interesting right there. And there was a Tibetan commentator, Tashi Tsinring. He said that what Prajnaparamita actually was understanding how things and events exist in terms of impermanence and their interdependence and their lack of intrinsic existence. Okay, remember last month we talked about the 12-fold chain of interdependence, and you essentially just chanted it when you chanted you chanted the Heart Sutra. So the idea here is that what Prajnaparamita is actually an insight into the fact that all things are interconnected. Okay, and all things are impermanent. So that's really super interesting to me, because you double that all the way back to the first noble truth. And what is it that's causing you so much pain and discomfort? First of all, a belief that something, namely you, your own ego, is independent, that there is a boundary between you and everything else, and that secondly, that you're somehow permanent, or something that you see in the world, you know, you attach to, and you don't understand that as impermanent. So I really love this interpretation of Prajnaparamita, that what it is, that wisdom really doesn't cut I mean, wisdom is important. I get it. And, you know, we talked about a minute ago that allegory of faucets, that you need wisdom to know when to apply the other Prajnaparamita, I mean, the other paramitas. But that what wisdom really is the insight and the understanding that everything around us is interconnected and nothing is permanent. Because if you can accept those two things and really live with that truth, that's pretty life changing. So I thought that was really interesting. And something that came out of the Chinese tradition, uh, you know, and we've talked about this at length many times, from the 5th century to the 7th century CE was the period where Mahayana Buddhism was introduced in a big way into China. Of course, there was Chinese Buddhism before that, and there were writings that precede that. But that 500 to 700 period was this huge flourishing of Buddhist teaching in China. And what they decided was that there were 3 gifts that a Buddhist practitioner needed to give the rest of the world. You know, so this is kind of the culmination of what these paramitas are supposed to be doing. They're supposed to result in 3 gifts that you give the rest of the world. You give everybody else around you. First one is the gift of material goods, which is essentially dana. Second one is super interesting, the gift of fearlessness. Okay. And then third is the gift of the Dharma. And I believe that the gift of fearlessness and the gift of the Dharma are done by example. You know, I can't think of other ways. I mean, you know, before I leave here, I could give somebody this book, but I gave you a book. I didn't really give you the Dharma. So that's what we all do for each other, is this gift of Dharma. And you know, I'm still tumbling around this gift of fearlessness, but I really like the way it sounds. You know, because we're seeing a lot of fearlessness around us now by a lot of people that are being very active and trying to fight for the right things.
Michael, if you want to take questions now or defer to them.
I defer them for a few minutes. And this Chinese tradition, the 3 gifts, it's also a key factor in the Tibetan Bodhisattva path. So where this turned up in the history of Buddhism is really kind of unstuck. I think it's one of those things was probably there from the very beginning. So when we look at the paramitas, you know, I think what's happening is these are much older ideas than the historical Buddha. And they were, obviously he had to teach his followers in terms that they could follow and they could understand. So these things were incorporated into the teaching. And then several hundred years later, when we had Buddhism in a written form, that other commentators could start writing about and say, well, here's what this means. Here's what he's saying here. But keep in mind that by the time we got that commentary written, Buddhism was no longer widespread throughout India. This commentary was happening in Sri Lanka and probably Bactria and then later in China. So we're going to have a little bit of a cultural difference already from what was probably originally taught. But, I think these are really worth looking into in depth. Generosity, morality, patience, diligence, meditation, and ultimately culminating in wisdom. And again, links back to, I think, the point of sitting. Because half of these really aren't going to be accessible to anybody until you have learned how to control the way your mind works. That relationship between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. Until you're able to respond to things and just react instead of just reacting. I don't think that even half of these are available to us. Okay, so that is everything I had, except for there was a couple of passages in here that I thought were really good. Well, here's where he said the first three, generosity, morality, and tolerance, are practices for anyone. The final three, however, energy, meditation, wisdom, operate at a higher level of spiritual awareness and therefore tend to be the focus of monks, nuns, and others who give priority in their lives to spiritual practice and insight. That smacks a little bit of elitism, but I think the idea is that until you've established your practice, you're probably not operating in that realm. So I think there's just another way to spin what he's trying to say, but I still think it's interesting. And then this idea that I touched on a little bit. Today, the English word meditation is practically synonymous with the styles of meditation that were engendered and developed in India. Meditation is the quintessential India's religious practice and our own image of it to reflect those cultural connotations. But since meditation is an English word, branching back through medieval Europe into classical Latin and Greek roots, it's important to recognize that the reason this word was chosen to translate and name the Indian practices was that those practices bore significant similarity to Western practices. So we'll start with you.
When you talked about fearlessness, and I think very shortly after that, you spoke of Tibetan Buddhism. And of course, in the Shambhala tradition, one of the key notions that comes up is the idea of being a warrior.
Mm-hmm.
And there is something of a conflict. There's something of a conflict, it seems to me, between being a warrior in the conventional sense of being a Mongol who comes through because, well, you people kill him back. You people kill emissaries.
Yeah.
That we're going to have to get rid of people that are so uncivilized. And fearlessness which immediately makes me think of that old Norman Rockwell picture where there is the aged mother and her son sitting in a truck stop. And they're praying over their food, and all the truckers are gathered around them. And some of them are sort of interested, some of them are sort of mocking, some of them are sort of loud, and that's fearlessness.
Well, yeah, and I would agree with that. Because I mean, look at the word Mahasattva. That's what the word means. It means warrior for enlightenment. So I would definitely agree with that. When I think when the word fearlessness when the enters my brain, the first thing I think of is Tank Man from Tiananmen Square.
Yes.
That to me was the quintessential definition of Tank Man. The guy went out and stopped a line of tanks with nothing in his hand but a plastic bag. You know, I don't think Arnold Schwarzenegger in the Predator movies, as much as those movies are a lot of fun, but that's not fearless to me. Fearlessness to me. I mean, the first thing I think of is Tank Man. You know, that guy was a Mahasattva. Nobody has any idea what happened to him, but that to me was fearlessness. So I could see, yeah, the prayer and the truck stop being the same thing. Yeah.
So as I take it, the way you're defining fearlessness, in that sense, is in the social sphere. How would you speak of fearlessness in the personal sphere?
It's the same thing that he walked out in front of a line of tanks. He saw what they were doing was completely unjust.
But I mean, for those of us who did not do that, do not do that, how does fearlessness come into our meditation?
Well, we live in a world of constant 100% stimulation. We are literally entertained to the point of insanity. And I think that it takes a certain amount of fearlessness to say, this isn't right, this isn't healthy. I think the thing that our culture is the most frightened of is boredom. I think that's one of the things we fear the most because we live in this world of constant stimulation. And to come to a place, and when these techniques were thought up, when people first started to sit in Zazen, we didn't have anechoic chambers. There was no way to cut the senses off 100%. We didn't have float chambers, things like that. I don't know if anybody's ever experienced those kinds of things. This was the closest you could get. And still, I think in a lot of ways is the closest way you can get to cutting off that stimulation and facing boredom square in the face.
It's also true that they did not have the supersaturated stimulus environment that we live in.
Not super saturated in terms of technology, but I guarantee you that if you went into town and went into the market, you could be just as saturated as you wanted to be. I mean, they had alcohol, they had brothels, they had drugs, they had, there was violence, there was all these things to chew up their brains. But I think that it's an act of fearlessness to just sit. And I think, you look at the folklore. What was the first thing Bodhidharma did when he got to China? Stared at a cave wall for 9 years. I mean, that is an act of fearlessness. But boredom scares us to death. I can't think of anything that frightens most people more than boredom.
There was a study done in America, 10 years ago maybe. People were most afraid to be alone with their thoughts.
Yeah.
Thoughts.
Well, Walker Percy, one of my favorite novelists, he had a great definition for boredom. He said that boredom was the self stuffed with the self. So that idea of we're creating all of these false selves to avoid having to deal with our truest self. And I don't think you're going to find a truer self when you're sitting in here silent, staring at a wall.
I want one more comment, and I want to ask John to see if he has anybody online. I had a friend met in New York one time, and he had a theory, he was trying to write a PhD in history, and he had a theory of history that boredom was a big factor in history, that when people had enough roots and berries, they started raiding the neighboring tribe for the women and stuff. And boredom was part of what was driving that. And I think I convinced him to abandon that because I said, I don't think there is any such thing as boredom. Boredom is poverty of imagination. If you could imagine that you're so secure and safe that you can become bored, you're simply not aware of the dire straits in which you find yourself. You're ignoring a lot. We can't be bored. I think there's a connection there to ignorance, or willful ignorance, you could call it. Anyone online, John? Anyone?
We have a hand up from Corolla.
Good morning, everybody.
Hey, Corolla.
Hey, when you talk about bravery, to study the way is to study the self. To study the self is to know the self. And to keep going after that takes more guts than standing in front of tanks, in my opinion, to recognize and release that notion of the self is an incredibly hard thing to do and an incredibly frightening thing to do. That's my comment. I
And I
love
think
to
that's
talk, by the way.
Thank you. I'm really happy you were here as always. And I think you're dead right. And because you're going to have to face that. I mean, I think that one of the points of practicing Zen is to come to grips with the idea that you're not always going to exist. And I think that that is the greatest act of fearlessness, is to know I'm not here forever, and to really incorporate that and to do that with joy. Not that you go marching to your own death happy about it, but that you accept the fact that I'm not here forever. I came into the world for a certain amount of time, and I will eventually have to leave this world. And to not be attached to your own life to the point that it causes you an incredible amount of strife, that you're not able to do that you're not able to make that transition. I think that that's one of the greatest dilemmas of having a human brain. I mean, look at what most religious teaching has done to avoid having to confront that, is invented this crazy idea of this afterlife. Oh yeah, you'll keep going forever. Your physical body's gonna die, but you're gonna keep going forever. I mean, to me, that's just like some kind of pablum or opiate to keep you from having to confront the fact that A, you're not here forever, but B, you're connected to everything else. You're not this independent psyche. So yeah, I think it takes an incredible amount of fearlessness just to come to those two conclusions.
The point is not that I won't exist for very long. It's that I don't exist at all, in the sense that we've been
Yeah,
raised to believe.
that's true. Yeah. Yeah.
And once that I does not exist, then there's nothing left to feel fear.
Yeah. I would agree with that. I would say that when they divided jhana up into 4 distinct levels, that's one of the reasons they did it. You're not going to come to that conclusion by coming to the Zen Center for a couple of weeks. That's the kind of conclusion you're going to come to much, much closer to the end of your journey. That 4th level, it's going to take a while to get there and really internalize that I'm connected to everything else. And, therefore me as an independent idea doesn't even exist. And also that idea is not even permanent. It's not here forever.
I have one comment on that before we move forward, and we'll take turns to come back into the center here. If there were anything truly wrong with death, for instance, I don't think we would be able to sleep at night. Every day you wake up and you die. And you wake up the next day, and you die again. That's very convincing. You think, forever. We all know it's not. So you could look at a whole lifetime, 70, 80, 100 years. You woke up and you went to sleep. Just over a longer period than each day. We do it every day. Try to stay awake tonight and see what happens. Let's see, John, we're in the room again. Comment, any question? Here we have one. Please give us your name.
My name is Jesse.
Hey, Jesse.
You just,
So I used to work as a hospice nurse, and oftentimes that meant Alzheimer's dementia type patients. And I absolutely loved spending time with them. But I think that it was always interesting to me is that the people that were most uncomfortable sometimes were loved ones, and thinking, oh, this person doesn't remember me, they're not remembering the moment. And I read somewhere one time that said one of the greatest places of enlightenment was in an individual with dementia and Alzheimer's, because they were forced to live in that moment by moment type of existence. And some of the happiest individuals I ever met in my life were those individuals. And I think it was always interesting to see the people around them who were uncomfortable with that idea versus it made me feel more of that fearlessness of what it is to live in that moment and to get rid of that identity and just to like be there, and not have that fear of death. I think that everyone around them was so consumed by that, and they just weren't. And I thought that was beautiful, and it was one of the greatest jobs I've ever had for that reason.
thank you very much for that. Yeah, and I couldn't agree. I've worked as an EMT and had experiences with dementia patients, and one of the things that I noticed about them is sometimes they're absolutely hilarious sometimes, you know. And yeah, you're right. Their family's freaking out, everybody else is around them, but the things they would say to me when I was in the ambulance with them were absolutely hilarious. Yeah, one guy we had to take to a psych unit, and the person in the room next to him had obviously lost their minds, and they were making up gospel songs as they were going, and the songs weren't making any sense, and she could not sing. It was completely atonal. And me and this guy were just out in the hall together, and she would like shift melody every couple of bars, and it was the craziest performance I've ever heard. But he just like shook his head and he goes, well, at least she knows more than one flipping song, you know. And you know, somebody that was like all wrapped up in their situation wouldn't have said anything like that, you know. Yeah. But I'm sure you have hundreds more experiences than I possibly could.
I think it's just as kind of crazy as it seems, I try to take a lot of lessons from those individuals. You know, everyone's like, oh, they've lost their mind. They're so there. They're
Yeah.
so present. They are living off of this life that they've had in the past that they don't even know, but it's like core to who they are. They're just truly themselves in the moment, day in and day out. It's beautiful.
Thank you very much for that insight. I'm glad you were here.
Over to you, John.
Okay. Anybody want to offer a thought, question, share something that came up for you? We've got a hand up from Joseph.
Hey, Shinjin, just wanted to say thanks for the brilliant discussion. And I guess just thinking about the animal behavior component of boredom, I definitely agree with Sensei, it's a lack of imagination, but just, I guess thinking about like primatology, right? Like something like, you know, great apes and chimps, they have a lot of similar behaviors as us. They have like, you know, wars and social stratification. And I guess just, you know, and a lot of them are also situated in their local environments very favorably. So they don't have to spend a lot of time, you know, doing drudgery and work. They have a lot of time just to hang out and relax. But this is actually kind of a bad thing for the lowest, least socially elevated members of the group, because the powerful ones have a lot of time to tweak them and like to basically to punish them for being of a lower social rank. And they have, like the least favored chimps will have like higher blood pressure and lower life expectations. And anyway, whatever, I know it's analogies, but I do think there's some relevance to the fact that we exist in this like richest, most prosperous society on earth, and yet everyone's miserable, and all these liberal societies are demanding their own turbulent ungrounding. Anyway, don't let me get on a whirlwind here, but thank you for the discussion. Yeah.
It's not a whirlwind at all, because like when you were describing chimpanzees, I was sitting here thinking that's not chimpanzees, that's Republicans. But
Don't be partisan there.
yeah. But Joseph, as usual, I appreciate your insights, and I'm glad you were here. Yeah, but boredom is like, I realize that wasn't the main focus of the talk, but yeah, that's definitely something to consider. There's a great book on the subject by the novelist David Foster Wallace. It's called The Pale King, and he took the most boring job he could possibly imagine, which was being an IRS auditor. But there was one IRS auditor that was so immune to boredom that when he really got into his zone auditing tax returns, he would levitate. And they gave him the name the Pale King, because he was able to conquer boredom so well. And I think a really interesting thing happens with boredom if you're willing to sit and work with it. If you're willing to like really like commit, what happens is things become incredibly interesting. Minute details and minute shifts in your sensory field. That things just that they take on this different meaning. One of the like really profound experiences I had when we were over at Candler Park, we faced this granite rock wall. And so you sit there, you're looking at this rock wall, and it's just granite. So there's like little flecks of quartz and feldspar and that kind of thing in the granite. And this wall would take on this incredible level of complexity. And, your brain would start playing these tricks on you. The wall would transform into the faces of every person you'd ever disappointed. But, yeah, but I think that you keep going through boredom and there's something really incredibly interesting on the other end of it. Yeah.
And then I direct the question to Sensei, does art arise out of boredom because the society has to be at a particular level where we're no longer worried about, can we get enough food? Can we get enough water?
I'd say on a sociological level, on a personal level, I don't think so. I think it arises more out of visionary experiences. At least it did for me. I did have something you might want to talk about, Shinjin. Joseph's comment on the comfortable position of the chimpanzee tribe, and in that situation, the superior ones or the high-ranking ones start picking on the low-ranking ones, and it creates stress differences. But maybe you want to talk about what happens when they face a common enemy. They all unite in some way. So, and you're looking at the situation we're in, we're supposedly economic disaster. You can't find a parking spot on my street because there's $50,000 and $100,000 cars bumper to bumper all up and down every block. So how could this be an economic problem, right? And so maybe this idea of a common enemy uniting everybody is another thing foil to set against that chimpanzee internal dissension when we're all too comfortable.
Well, I would say go back to the Paramitas themselves and define what that common enemy would be. And if you decide you've got an enemy, are you still being moral? Are you still being mindful of the situation? Are you still putting the Dharma into place. I mean, if you've decided you've got an enemy and you've abandoned the Dharma, what good is it?
When Genghis Khan came over the hill. everybody
You don't get to
died.
decide.
What's that?
You don't always get to decide about having an enemy.
You don't. No, you don't. But you do get to decide whether you're going to stick to the Eightfold Path or not. You do get to decide whether you're going to stick to your vows or not. So that's where I would cut off. Am I living up to my vows and to the Dharma by taking on an enemy? Because in reality, like, what Corolla just said a minute ago, there is no real self. So if there's no self, who is this enemy? And I think if we put that into play, we would realize that 99.9% of our enemies aren't even real. I mean, yeah, there were situations where you saw the Mongols advancing over the hill, but in your daily life, I mean, how many Mongols do you come across? And the only Mongolians I've ever met were very nice. So, I mean, that's what I would ask is what exactly is this enemy? If you don't exist, then that enemy probably doesn't exist either. There's no boundary between the two of you.
The other principle you pointed out there is they brought this on themselves. Mongols weren't coming over the hill just for no reason. It's because you killed their emissary. And that's a form of ignorance. You didn't know that killing your emissary triggered this.
Yeah.
So you were haughty in your ignorance. I see Corolla's hand up.
Why not,
Well,
instead of talking about common enemy, talk about common cause? Because we've seen how communities have come together after natural disasters. We saw how some parts of our society came together during COVID. We can see that having a disaster of that sort, a threat, not necessarily a human threat, gets some people together and drives other people apart, leads some
Yeah.
people to work as a group and some to say, boy, what can I get out of this?
I agree 100%. I mean, I work in public health, and when I went down to the stadium and saw all of those people filing in to get vaccinated, I mean, it was probably 10 to 15,000 people in there at any one time. And I mean, yeah, that's definitely a common cause. And all of the people, the nurses, the technicians, and everybody else that was getting those people in and out of there, and the people who developed the vaccine, yeah, that was definitely a common cause. I mean, in our life, we've never seen anything like that. In human history, we have never seen anything quite like the response to COVID. We will again. Anybody with background in epidemiology will tell you that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when and how bad. But yeah, I agree. Common cause is a much better way to put it than common enemy.
apparently it's going to be worse because the hospitals are closing down.
Well,
And there'll be fewer hospitals and fewer medicals to take care of.
we'll have to see. But
The populations are growing.
yeah, were you just fixing your hair, or did you?
Oh, no, I had like I
Comment?
was like multitasking.
Yeah, I forget the people that actually have hair.
Well, and I want to say, first of all, I feel like we need to apologize to the chimps for comparing who to Republicans. That was kind of rude of us, but, I was thinking a lot about boredom, because I think I'm someone who's very terrified of boredom, if I'm being, or I was, and I'm getting used to not. And I read this really great essay, and it's from the 50s, I think. It's called In Praise of Shadows, and it's by this Japanese man. And when Japan opened its gates, like to the rest of the world, they received, electricity, like all these things that everyone else had gradually introduced, Japan got flooded with it. And there was this really interesting where he talked about how, you know, they get the overhead lighting and how it's like incompatible with like how their houses are built. And how starting to go back to thinking about in praise of shadows of like how their bowls and their cups just didn't look as beautiful anymore because of just the intense lighting, and how you could stay up all night, and like how like losing oil lamps, like you couldn't go to sleep at the same time or you could be up all night. And it made me think a lot about how like we have like the TV, we have music players that travel with the cell phones and all these different things, and like how we try to um we were so attached. Now I think I'm seeing a lot of people detach, like people are, you know, bringing back cassettes and vinyl and
Mhm.
trying to go to dumb phones and do all these things, and I think it's very exciting in a way of like
Yeah.
to pull that back, and I'm very curious if we've like just oversaturated ourselves and there is just this like pullback and like
What's left?
Who wrote that essay?
I'm gonna have to look it up. I have it in book.
Praise of Shadows. I can't remember his name.
The, the title of it is In Praise of Shadows?
Yes.
Okay, I will definitely find it, because
It's
that
phenomenal.
that idea sounds a lot like Ivan Illich.
Mhm. Yeah.
It sounds a lot like his ideas, which I think are flipping brilliant. But yeah, that's yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of I think the technology is actually making us ill to a certain degree. I mean, staring at screens for 12 hours a day, I think that's what it's going to do to your eyesight.
Yeah.
And
But-
socially ill too, I would say.
Well, socially ill, because I mean, watch 2 or 3 hours of Fox News. And that idea, remember, you know, I talked about the amygdala. I talked about the amygdala, the way that they phrase things, the way they set their shows up, the things those people say, it's just constant pounding on the amygdala. And, you know, it's not, there's nothing in there about rational thought. It's just constantly pounding the system in your body that controls outrage.
Yeah.
You know, fear and outrage.
And I was gonna add too, because like it made me think a lot, because I read that essay because my friend recommended it to me, and she hiked the Pacific Coast Trail for several months. It was just her and her thoughts. And we talked a lot about that because after I survived Hurricane Katrina and I didn't have power or like running water for 2 months.
Mhm.
And yeah, in no school, we weren't going to school or anything. So it was definitely strangely one of the happier times of my life, despite all the devastation, like so many people were in my house. But at night, you know, you had to go to bed. It was just dark out and there's like nothing you could do. We didn't have enough, you know, supplies to really last 2 months. So yeah, it was just such an interesting, and like all, you know, a lot of my books got destroyed. So it's like there's no power, so I can't even entertain myself. Um, it was, yeah, so you just like were out wandering the streets, just walking around, you know, but it was definitely, and then like getting to get back into the world, so to speak, like get all that stuff back. And then now I'm like I'm finding myself pulling away from that again. And that's like why my friend gave me that essay. It's like, try not to turn the overhead lighting on, try not to just have the TV on for background noise. And yeah, it's just been those little things and like how your awareness kind of spreads and you have time to think or not think.
That to me, what you just said in that experience, between the two of you, those two experiences, I think, really summarize a lot of what Zen is about. Yeah, so you guys are bodhisattvas before you even realized it. Well, I can't think of anything more bodhisattva than a hospice nurse, to be honest with you.
They're all in scrubs. I do have a comment. If you go to a retreat, like a 5-day retreat, it's what in the 60s psychedelic revolution days we call a reentry problem. Coming back out of the experience, you have to sort everything out again. One of my students at the school there, not the Art Institute, University of Illinois, she said, take LSD, it's like dumping all your drawers in the house into one big pile. But then the next day, you have to put all that stuff back where it goes. And if you go on a retreat, sufficiently long, 4 or 5 day retreat, you'll find when you come out of it, you have the same kind of reentry problem. You don't want to listen to the radio, you don't want to read the paper, you don't even want to drive home. You know, it's just, the world is too much with us. Local Roshi would say, civilization conquers us. And people asked me what I thought he meant by that, and I said, I think, you know, the world is too much with us. It's not the way it was in Buddha's time, Dogen's time. So, although they had, as Shinjan pointed out, they had their own problems, like the Four Noble Truths still apply. But if you look at the mess we're in, and we can cut through all this clutter and get down to something as basic as what Zen is asking us to do, that's going to be a big effing deal. That's going to be a big accomplishment.
We're good. I think we're at time.
We are at 53, 7 minutes. So one more question or comment online or closing comments by Shinjan.
Joseph posted the name Junichiro Tanizaki.
That's it.
Junichiro, Junichiro.
Yeah, that's okay. So that's who wrote the Frozen
Yeah,
Shadows.
once you said the name, I was like, that is the
That's
name.
yeah, because that's the same guy that wrote The Key
Yes.
and wrote Some Prefer Nettles and the Makaoka sisters.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm actually a big fan of his fiction.
Yeah.
So cool. I'm looking
Yeah,
forward
and they
to
have
finding
it in
it.
book form, so you
Yeah.
can like get the little book as well. I think it's online as well. Like
I will definitely find it. Well, thank you for that.
I think I've got a copy at home. I'll bring it in. And I've also got 2 of Ivan Illich's works. I did a summer stint at his CDOC in Cuernavaca one summer, where I taught meditation.
Is it considered a novel? I looked it up, but it doesn't say if it's novel or.
I think it was a long
real
form essay
experience.
that's like it got put into book form.
Interesting.
But I wouldn't say it's novel or even to me novella like
Real.
pretty short.
You ready?
But a lot of
Closing comments?
Thank you for being here.